Good morning, everyone. It's my great joy to get to be with you here today and on this particular topic. For whatever reason, this topic has been one of my favorites since I was a teenager. The idea of tragedy and redemption resonate very strongly in my heart, and so I'm very pleased to get to share together on this topic. Now, what I find very fascinating is at first glance, this topic seems to be examining the mechanisms of how devotees fall. Krishna paints such a clear illustration of how the mind, beginning to become fixated on sense objects, becomes attached to them, fixated upon them, until eventually, as one of my friends said, you wake up one morning and find that you're gnashing your teeth in hell. How did we get here? And similarly, for the last 2,000 years, we have pondered how is it that Judas, who, though having the great blessing of being with Jesus Christ himself, managed to be seduced by worldly practicality, money, fame, power, to the point where he fell so terribly. And all those are very interesting directions to take a conversation on this morning, I actually want to take a little bit of a tangential one. I want to explore less how devotees fall, but really getting more to the heart of why. Why do we fall? Why is it that God made this world such that we could fall in the first place? Because if God is truly merciful, and if God is good, and if God's truth is always good, then even a fall should be to our benefit if turned in the right way. And perhaps the right way could be seen through sincerity, through hope, and through courage. In the autobiography of a yogi, there's a wonderful story called Sashi and the Three Sapphires. And in this story, Yogananda, when he himself is a college student, has the great good fortune of spending most of his time with his self-realized avatar guru, Swami Kriyananda. But Yogananda, charged with the zeal of someone who has found truth and wants to share it with others, proselytizes quite freely, which I'm happy to say that I try my best to imitate. But Yogananda said that he would take many of his college student friends to see his guru, to come to the ashram. And he said there, temporarily, they would cast aside this socially attractive garment of skepticism and would embrace, at least temporarily in the presence of the master, a willingness to seek God and to appreciate wisdom. And there was one young man that Yogananda brought before Sri Yukteswar by the name of Sashi. And he says that Sri Yukteswar and this young man found an immediate rapport and a great liking for one another, and that Sri Yukteswar became quite affectionate of him, which is a wonderful thing to remember, given that many times we think of Sri Yukteswar as being, this lion of impersonal punishment, but he took great affection to this young man. And what I find very interesting is Sri Yukteswar kind of doted on him a little bit, but would often scold him and would say, Sashi, you must reform your life. And Yogananda just tactfully says that the young man had a bit of a wild and unruly life, which as a college student, all we need is to think one or two moments what that might look like, and we'd have a pretty good idea. And Yukteswar told Sashi many times, you must reform yourself. And Sashi would reply back, oh, master, I place my faith in you. How could anything harm me? And Sri Yukteswar told him, you should at least wear a blue sapphire. And Sashi said, well, sir, I am willing, but my flesh is weak. My will is weak. I can't actualize the things that you're asking me. So you'll just have to save me. And isn't it interesting that on the surface level, we might praise that attitude as being devotional or as being self-surrendering, but actually, isn't it rather cowardly? He professes to love Sri Yukteswar, but refuses to listen to what he says. Sri Yukteswar warns him, Sashi, in 1 year's time, you will become gravely ill, and you will come place before me 3 beautiful sapphires, which will then be of no use to you. But the boy does not heed this warning, and he carries on in his ways. And Yogananda says that a year later, whilst meditating in a friend's home in Kolkata, the door burst open downstairs, and Sri Yukteswar said to Yogananda, it's that boy, Sashi. He's come. His lungs are far gone, and he is dying. Go, Tell him I do not wish to see him." Then shocked, Yogananda descends the stairs and sure enough finds Sashi there and relays the message that the master does not want to see him. Sashi bursts into tears and running past Yogananda, runs upstairs, prostrates himself before the master and casts at his feet 3 beautiful sapphires. And he says, "Beloved Guru, the doctors say I am dying. They say I have galloping tuberculosis and that it is just weeks until I will die. Please, you must save me." And Sri Yukteswar falls into a silence. And Yogananda said he watched for an hour as Sri Yukteswar sat in a sphinx-like silence as this young man wept before his feet. But Yogananda then says that he intuitively perceived that Sri Yukteswar was merely testing his sincerity. Because the boy knew this was God himself incarnated in flesh before him. And the boy did not let go of his guru's feet, tears flowing from his face until at long last the guru opened his eyes and said, "Why do you have these gems? They are of no more use to you. Take them back, return them to the jewelers." And the boy said, "But sir, will I die? Will I live?" And Yukteswar says, "It will be easier now for the sun and moon to exchange positions in the sky than for you to die. Shall I drink the medicines that my doctors prescribe to me? Drink them or drink them not. It does not matter." This boy then went on. His disease progressed. He very nearly died. And on the eve of his deathbed, he said that he felt the presence of Sri Yukteswar and suddenly he felt himself completely well. And Yogananda found him recovering and drinking and eating food and made a full recovery and went on to live a full and well life. So his sincerity, you see, saved him. He fell spiritually, but his great sincerity, coupled with his desperate desire for aid, spared him. But in fact, it only spared him partially, because Yogananda goes on to relate that the story is actually tragic, and that after this, he said, this miraculous healing had the unfortunate combination of impairing Sashi's manners but stiffening his spine, and that Sashi never returned to the ashram again. What a tragedy. Here's this young man saved by the brink of death by the miraculous intervention of his guru, and he's ashamed. Now, of course, I can understand, can't you? Wouldn't you too be ashamed to have so idly discarded the words and the counsel of a God-realized master, and then at death's door to be saved by no merit of your own, but by the compassion and the goodness of God alone? It would be natural for the human ego to be ashamed, as he was. But you see, my friends, that brings me to my next quality, hope. We must never forget that we are children of God, and that no matter how many sins we have committed, no matter how much mud we pile on the gold of our soul, that gold remains gold. For my second example, I'll actually cast our eyes back to the most famous betrayer of all Christendom, Judas himself. Judas betrayed Jesus because, as it says in this reading, a growing infatuation with worldly practicality, with money, with a desire for power, perhaps even the misguided desire to help Jesus himself reach more people, but nonetheless, with his worldly desires for power. But now let's just ponder and let's really imagine for a moment the grief that must have overtaken him when he realized that he betrayed the Messiah for a handful of silver. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? For him to look down and to realize that not only had he traded a life, a man's life, but the greatest man that he would ever know for 20 pieces of paltry silver. And of course, as we know, Judas hanged himself out of his regret, out of his shame, out of his horror at what he had done. But as Swami Kriyananda writes in one of his songs, The Non-Blues, which is actually surprisingly one of my favorites and most oft-sung, he says, "Why multiply grief with despair?" My friends, we all err. We all make mistakes, but how often do we compound that grief with the despair? of thinking our failures final. Interestingly enough, in one of his essays, Swami Kriyananda offers this incredible observation that Judas's fall was not merely in betraying Jesus, but was in thinking that it had been the final arbiter of his fate. He, in essence, thought that his sin was more powerful than Jesus' power of redemption, was greater than God's power of love. And that was the much greater sin, even than betraying the Messiah. And that Swamiji writes that if only Judas in that final moment had repented, had acknowledged his mistake, and then dedicated the rest of his life to trying to mitigate that error and to trying to spread the news that Christ was the Savior, that he had been resurrected, and that he loved even me, the worst among all sinners, so surely he will love you as well. That Judas might have transmuted much of that karma, and that he would have been free much more quickly. And so what we need, my friends, is hope. Judas lost hope. And they say that when we despair, Satan wins. My friends, never despair. Never despair. As Yogananda said, when man wills, he sets his feet firmly on the path to victory. And that is the next quality that I would like to examine together. Courage. For if we have sincerity, we have that deep yearning, the great desire to know God, to overcome our limitations, and we have the hope to recognize that no matter how vile our past actions may have been, that is not who we need be today, nor tomorrow, nor the morrow after that. But what is required to make those aspirations and those hopes real is the courage to enact them, the courage to live them. And this is where I now would like to bring the analogy home, back to our own lives, because it's one thing to compare the lives of Judas to our own, or the lives of Sashi, who miraculously was healed by tuberculosis, and you might well and reasonably think in this audience, well, I've never been healed by tuberculosis. Well, nor have I. But yet I know what it is to tremble in fear before the doubt that maybe God doesn't love me. That's what all of us can take away from this. There was a woman who once went to Swami Kriyananda after having endured some trials and tragedies. I think her life really had some very tragic experiences. I don't remember the particulars of it, but they actually don't matter. And going to him, she tried to show a good attitude. And she tried to say, well, but it's okay, everything's perfect, everything's perfect. And Swamiji, much to her surprise and much to many of our surprise, scolded her and said, do not comfort yourself with a lie. Just like this affirmation, if we have made mistakes, let us face them bravely, courageously, heroically. For it is only by acknowledging that the mistake was made, that the suffering paid, that we want to rise again. And so, my friends, let's have the courage to introspect, to recognize that to fall spiritually doesn't mean that you have to abandon the spiritual path. But as Yogananda said, it means that we crucified the teachings of our Guru daily when instead of responding with kindness, we respond with hatred. When instead of responding with love, we respond with fear. When instead of remembering God's omnipresence, we become infatuated again with the world and the world alone. But it need not be that way. So why do we fall? We fall because we do not yet understand. We fall because we have presumed upon a level of consciousness which is not yet truly ours. As Yogananda put it once when he was scolding a disciple, he was telling a disciple how to reform and how to change their life, and the disciple said, yes, sir, I understand. And Yogananda said, you do not understand. Because if you did, you would change. But what inspires us to change? Very simply, it is joy, or it is grief. What inspires us to change on this path is that we taste ever new joy, we taste love, we taste peace in our meditation. And that begins to lure us forwards, back home again. But the other equally important and oft overlooked spur on the spiritual path is pain, is tragedy. That is when we realize we do not yet understand and we begin to hunger for true understanding. I don't know about you, but I have repeated many mistakes many times. And as it said in this reading, at first it's easy to make an error and then to cast it gleefully at the doorstep of your nearest neighbor and actually say that it was their fault after all. I mean, after all, wouldn't you have? Surely any reasonable person would have. But yet who bears the karmic weight of our misdeeds? Ourselves. And eventually our own misery prompts us to a greater degree of introspection and honesty, and we begin to recognize that we must have done something wrong. And then that sincerity comes forth, and we say, I must have done something wrong, and I yearn for something greater. As Jesus wrote in the Beatitudes, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. My friends, it is appropriate to mourn when we make mistakes. And mistakes we make. Think every day of all the little ways in which you betray your highest ideals. Don't sweep those griefs under the rug, but face them squarely and demand of God then the power to overcome them, to never err again, or at least to have the courage to try. If all we do is chase happiness, we're rejecting the world. We're rejecting life in a certain sense. Pain, too, is our teacher. Accept it open-heartedly as coming from God, and it, too, can be a prod towards your ultimate goal of realization in Him alone. But this takes enormous courage. It requires that we be willing to face ourselves exactly as we are, not as we wish we were, not even as we hope to be, but as we are squarely right now. But you know what's interesting? There's a very practical argument for this, which is that I teach singing. I teach singing to the high school students. For those who don't know, I'm one of the teachers at our Living Wisdom High School. And one of the things I tell my students is sing poor but proud. Because I'd rather hear you make a mistake so I can correct you than you never have the courage to live at all. And with my students, it's very interesting that I notice the ones who are boldest make the most progress. Because if you sing boldly out of tune with the melody around you, you'll be able to hear rather quickly. I don't sound like the others, and I'd really like to, because that's so beautiful, and what I'm singing is so disharmonious. So too with our hearts. Be bold. Be open-hearted with the God and the masters. Hide nothing, but show Him everything like a good singing teacher. Sir, I don't know how to sing, but I'm going to sing poor and proud, and I'm going to listen to your melody of divine love. But of course, this takes enormous courage. We're all ashamed of our littleness, of our limitations, of our shortcomings. We all think to compare ourselves by our neighbors. But isn't it interesting when we compare ourselves to our neighbors, we always compare ourselves to their very best qualities and opposed to our worst? But the only way to improve is to take things exactly as they are, to open our hearts, to draw on the uplifting power and the grace of God and the masters, and to rise. When He wills, He places His feet firmly on the path to victory. So my friends, I'd like to end today with a letter from Master. I'm sure many of you have heard this, but this is one of Yogananda's letters which he wrote to a disciple, but in a way he wrote this to each of us. This is our Guru talking to us. So I invite you now to sit up straight and close your eyes and perhaps imagine not my voice, but his. And let's remember that perhaps the reason we fall is to give us courage, to give us wisdom, to give us strength, to give us greater ardor. Yogananda writes, "You must never lose courage. Divine Mother sent me to pilot you out of the clouds of your mind. Everybody's difficulty is different, and he or she has to win that test of karma. Overcome all by constant inward calling on God and utmost devotion in words, thought, action, and obedience to Guru. Your troubles I do not mind. I will never give up my job about you. It is better to conquer one evil and never live with it forever. Never for a moment identify yourself with momentary flashes of error. Have no fear. Even though I am gone from your visible eyes, you will never be alone. I may not scold you then, but I shall ever be with you, and through Divine Mother guard you from all harm, and will constantly whisper to you guidance through your loving self. So do not become discouraged and tired, but ever be interested in working for Divine Mother, no matter if war, sickness, death dances around you. Be cut to pieces, but never give up. Be like the divine leech. Suck at the blood of wisdom, even though torn to bits. A smooth life is not a victorious life. And I will give you lots of my good karma, so you will get through. I will not only ever forgive you, but ever lift you up, no matter how many times you fall. Keep unceasingly trying to conquer. Not only will I invisibly help you, but also too visibly through many here. I am not building a mansion for you, or giving you riches which will perish, but I am making an imperishable home with all the riches of my Divine Mother. And so, my friends, let's remember, as Jesus said, blessed are they who thirst for righteousness' sake, for they shall be satisfied. God bless us all.
Let's take a moment, ponder this inwardness. And we'll have some music.
Seeking freedom in a revolution. Oh, if you're seeking freedom, you won't find it there. For once the guns stop blazing, you'll find it amazing how the world can drag on just as before. If you're seeking freedom in a marble mansion, oh, if you're seeking freedom, you won't find it there. For even when it's sunny, you'll be counting money, keeping up that showcase your face lined with care. And if you're seeking freedom on a throne of power, oh, if you're seeking freedom, you won't find it there. For though when all obey you, what if they betray you? Tense you'll be and waiting for foes everywhere. But if you're seeking freedom, cast away desires, why barter like a beggar? You've wealth everywhere. For never can you buy it, grasp and you deny it. Freedom can't be hoarded, it's free as the air. And if you're seeking freedom, seek it on the mountains. Got sunlight on your shoulders, the wind in your hair. For there's no one can hold you, Once your heart is free, you'll be king everywhere. For there's no one can hold you, boss about or mold you. Once your heart is free, you'll